Good morning. Continuing on with the book of Ruth. Ruth chapter 2. I've split this up a little bit different than some other scholars would, but it allows us to approach this in usable sections. So, Luke 2 1 to 7, I've dealt with that piece right here. I've entitled this God Meets Your Needs. So, um, God will often help us in times of need by using people. People are the agents by which God uses to help us, whether that's a doctor, a friend, or a variety of other means. There are a variety of words here that I think need to be defined. Boaz means pillar. Often names are either representative of who they actually are, or it's the direct opposite, or it's more of who they should be. In here, Boaz's name fits his name perfectly, unlike um, uh, Naomi at the beginning of the story is not who her name claims that she is. The next word that comes up is a Hebrew word called meyada, a person you know well with regard to affection. Um, this speaks of um, a Naomi and his relationship. Next is the Hebrew word gibor, means might, warrior, wealth. Um, there's this idea of gleaning, as I've talked briefly before. Gleaning is to collect, pick together the leftover produce after a harvest has already been gathered. So the gleaning would have been the stuff that was left over. This idea that comes up of the idea of a kinsman redeemer denotes a near relative who is responsible for the economic well-being of a relative, and he comes into play especially when the relative is in distress and cannot help himself or herself out of the crisis, to ensure that the property of the clan never passes out of the clan. Leviticus 25, 25, and 30. Um, a little bit of background of gleaning. The reaper would grasp a handful of standing grain with one hand and would cut it cut it with a sickle held within the other hand. This handful of cut grain, the ears with which the attached stubs of the stalk, what was laid on the ground. So I would cut this, and this part I would throw off to the ground, be behind them. These handfuls were in turn gathered into bundles by the bundler who fills the arms. These bundles were probably then bound in sheaves, although it is possible that the bundles and sheaves are synonymous. The ordinary privilege of the gleaning we require that the gleaners work only in that part of the field in which they were harvesting, described above, had been completed, so they can only gather these sheaves when it's been completely cut off, and they would be behind them. And the sheaves would be removed to the threshing floor. So these would then be taken to another place called the threshing floor. Most probably, this is what is implied by the expression to glean behind somebody. followed behind the woman of the workers, a right of gleanage thus far exceeded anything according to the custom of the native Bethlehemites. This was coming from Bush's commentary on the Word Biblical Commentary. The reaping process in modern villages of the Middle East probably illustrated well the methods used during the biblical period. The the harvesters draw a handful of grain stalks together with their sickle, sometimes made of flint bait set in mortar bones. So sometimes that the sickle would have been more smaller, and sometimes it would have been longer. And graft the stalk in the other hand and cut them in from the sickle. The handful of grains are dropped and picked up by others who gather them into sheaves for transport to the threshing floor. In biblical times, gleaning took place after the removal of the sheaves. Reaping occurred when the grain harvest was ripe, usually in May for barley, in June or July for wheat. This is coming from Hare from the International Standard Biblical Encyclopedia on page 51, and previously, um, on page 51. So there's some definitions. It's important to understand what gleaning is and how that process was done, because this is a major focus here in our passage. Now, turning to Ruth chapter 2, verses 1 to 7 in the English Standard Version. Now, Naomi had a relative of her husband, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz, or whose name means pillar. And Ruth the Moabite. They're very clear to point out who. So they're pointing out in this story how she's a foreigner. Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi. Now it's interesting. They don't say Naomi the Bethlehemite. So pick up on those. Let me go to the field and glean among the ears grain after him, in whose sight I shall find favor. So she just is hoping that she will find favor in some person. And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. She happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz. It's providence here. She happened to come along this field of Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" So Boaz notices that this one woman, this stranger who is not typically on his field. And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is a young Moabite woman." So the emphasis on her being a Moabite is now twice in this passage. "Who came back among the sheaves after the reapers." So she came and she continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. A very brief outline of this passage is in verses 1 to 2, Boaz is introduced. Ruth seeks a field. Next, in verse 3, Ruth stumbles upon Boaz's field. And finally, Boaz notices Ruth. So, Verse 1 introduces a new character in the story, Boaz. His name means pillar, though the word for relative here occurs 6 times. So this idea of relative in this passage is used 6 times. Every time it is used, it speaks of someone who you know very well. So this is from the word that we had brought up earlier, um, Mayada is used 6 times in this passage. It's used in Job 19:14, Psalm 31:11, Psalm 55:13, Psalm 88:8, and Psalm 88:18. Rabbi suggests that he is Elimelech's nephew and Naomi's cousin. So Boaz here is a close relative of Elimelech, probably his nephew. Boaz is referred to as a worthy man. Word worthy here is um, the word Gibor, often translated as warrior. So Gibor is often translated as a warrior. Job 16:14 and Psalm 33:16. But it is also speaking of a person of wealth. So he's a warrior, and the word is also used as person of wealth. 2 Kings 15:20. Of wealth and ability, 1 Kings 11:28. It designates one who possesses social standing and a good reputation. In this context, it denotes not only wealth and status, but also ability, honor, and capability. Thus, it is clearly used as a description of character. Boaz is the right man, not only because he has the ability, but he comes from the right clan. But he is also the right man because he is a man of integrity and will do right by Naomi and Ruth, as we're going to see later on. It's not just about Ruth, but Ruth and Naomi. Verse 2 picks up with the story of particularly Ruth seeking to provide for Naomi and contribute to the household. So she understands, and she's really the only one that can work in the household. Ruth's Moabite origins are picked up again, and what would be a dominant theme of the book. Of the 7 times, it's used 5 times specifically identified to Ruth in the phrase Ruth the Moabite. Chapter 1, verse 22, chapter 2, verse 2, chapter 2, verse 21, chapter 4, verse 5, and chapter 4, verse 10. Ruth politely requests Naomi's permission to glean the fields. Ruth feels that she is under her authority and guidance. Let go. Halakna is often used for a polite request in Exodus 4:18, 2 Samuel 15:7, and Jeremiah 40:15. Much like we would say please. So halakna would be how we would say, please, can I go? After him is inserted by the translators. Many translations do not have this. For example, the NASB 95 has the phrase, one in whose side I might find favor. The NIV, anyone in whose side I find favor. And the NLT, by anyone who is kind enough to let me do it. So the ESV translators has inserted this. Next we see Naomi grants the request, and Ruth stumbles on Boaz's field. Gleaning is emphasized in this chapter. It occurs 12 times in this chapter. Gleaning was a process of gathering the leftover produce after the harvest has already been gathered. Gleaning was a process instituted by God so the poor would have an opportunity to provide for themselves. Deuteronomy 24:19, which says this: when you reap your harvest in your field and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back and get it. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow, and the Lord your God may bless you in all of your work and your hands. The phrase "she happened to come upon Boaz's field" is providential working in her life. Naomi and all of Israel. God's providentially working in lives very rarely just benefits us, but the providential working of God's life in us benefits other people as well. But it also benefits the wider scope of the people in his redemptive purposes. Much like the providential word working of Esther in Esther 6:1, where the king could not sleep and just happened to ask for his chronicles. So God's providential working in one person affects the wider scope. Next, Boaz notices Ruth in 2:47. The author uses a distinct construction, a hint of amazement or wonder. Look, it's Boaz. The passage is linked with so many references to providence, the reader is left with without a doubt that God is working behind the scenes. In verse 2, in whose sight I might find favor, happened to come upon the field of Boaz. Much like God provided for the ram of the sacrifice of Isaac, God is providing for Ruth and Naomi every step of the way. God is orchestrating events so that Ruth will meet the right person for her, and she is the right person for Boaz. We see Boaz as a godly man by the way he approaches his workers. He notices Ruth and inquires about her. The last phrase is incoherent in Hebrew, almost as if the former didn't know if he should have let her. There are far too many coincidences for this not to be God. She stumbles upon the field. The foremans allowed her to reap on the field. Boaz notices her with favor. Boaz is a man of integrity, very uncommon in the time of judges. Ruth fits the requirement for Boaz to be her kinsman redeemer. In verse 7, there are a variety of ways that you could interpret it. First, she asked for permission to glean, but was told no, so she waited. Second, she was actually gleaning, which would have been a huge break in cultural norms. Or third, she was asked to glean and was told to wait for the owner of the field. Either one of these are possible. So the NASB 95 says she had been sitting in the house for a little while. So they would probably lean that she was waiting either one or two. The NIV, except for a short rest in the shelter, which doesn't really include anything, except for a few minutes of rest in the shelter. Next, the Hebrew says this, that sitting in the house. And so, so these are the variety I want to introduce. So in verses 1 through 3, it's what's called as a chiasm. a chiasm is a unique structure in Hebrew that they would have picked up on, where you have your A, B, and C, and the main point being in the middle. So you have A not, B not, and C, which would be the main point. And here, so you have an A, B, C, and then you have a D. So that the main point would have come up in 2C, which would be behind someone in whose side I might find favor. So the main point of the passage of everything is that she would fall behind someone and she's leaning on the Lord she's trusting the Lord. Um, then in um, so I do want to point out a bit here that most commentators see three scenes. Um, 2:1 to 3, 2:4 to 17, and 2:17 to 23. I've broken it up a little bit different. I've broken up this second scene into two separate ones so that we can deal with them um, in, in a more usable way. I've gone over what this passage means, and hopefully that it was an encouragement to you.